Israel SHAHAK, Jewish History, Jewish Religion, The Weight of 3,000 Years, forward to the 1997 edition by Edward Said. Professor Israel SHAHAK, Emeritus Professor of Organic Chemistry at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, is one of the most remarkable individuals in the contemporary Middle East. I first met him and began a regular correspondence with him almost 25 years ago in the aftermath first of the 1977 and then the 1973 war. Born in Poland and having survived and then escaped a Nazi concentration camp, he came to Palestine immediately after World War II. Like all young Israelis of the time, he served in the army and for many years served in the military reserves for a short period every summer, as Israeli law requires. Possessed of a fierce, relentlessly inquisitive and probing intellect, SHAHAK pursued his career as an outstanding university lecturer and researcher in organic chemistry. He was often named the best teacher by his students and given awards for his academic performance, and at the same time began to see for himself what Zionism and the practices of the State of Israel entailed in suffering and deprivation, not only for the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza, but for the substantial non-Jewish, i.e., Palestinian minority, people who did not live in the expulsion of 1948, remained, and then became Israeli citizens. This then led him to a systematic inquiry into the nature of the Israeli state, its history, ideological and political discourses, which he quickly discovered were unknown to most non-Israelis, especially diaspora Jews, for whom Israel was a marvelous, democratic, and miraculous state deserving unconditional support and defense. He then re-established and was for several years the chairman of the Israeli League of Human Rights, a relatively small group of like-minded people whose idea it was that human rights should be equal for everyone, not just for the Jews. It was in that specific context that I first became aware of his work. The one thing that immediately distinguished SHAHAK's political positions from that of most other Israeli and non-Israeli Jewish doves was that he alone started the unadorned truth without consideration for whether that truth, if stated plainly, might not be good for Israel or the Jews. He was profoundly, and I would say aggressively and radically and anti-racist in his writings and public statements. There was one standard and one standard only for infractions against human rights, so it did not matter if most of the time Israeli Jews were assaulting Palestinians, since he, as an intellectual, had to testify against those assaults. It is no exaggeration to say that so strictly did he adhere to this position that he very soon became an extremely unpopular man in Israel. I recall that about 15 years ago, he was declared dead, although, of course, he was extremely alive. The Washington Post reported his death in a story which, after SHAHAK actually visited the post to prove that he was not dead, he gleefully told his friends, had no effect on the Post, which has never printed a correction. So to some people he is still dead, a wish fantasy that reveals how uncomfortable he makes friends of Israel's feel. It should also be said that Shahak's mode of telling the truth has always been rigorous and uncompromising. There is nothing seductive about it, no attempt made to put it nicely, no effort expended on making the truth palatable or somehow explainable. For Shahak, killing is murder is killing is murder. His manner is to repeat, to shock, to bestir the lazy or indifferent into galvanized awareness of the human pain that they might be responsible for. At times, Shahak has annoyed and angered people, but this is part of his personality, and it must be said of his sense of mission. Along with the late Professor Yehoshua Leibovitz, a man he deeply admired and often worked with, Shahak endorsed the phrase Judeo-Nazi to characterize methods used by the Israelis to subordinate and repress the Palestinians. Yet he never said or wrote anything that he did not find out for himself, see with his own eyes, experience directly. The difference between him and most other Israelis was that he made the connections between Zionism, Judaism, and repressive practices against non-Jews, and of course, he drew the conclusions. A great deal of what he writes has had the function of exposing propaganda and lies for what they are. Israel is unique in the world for the excuses made on its behalf. Journalists either do not see or write what they know to be true for fear of blacklisting or retaliation. Political, cultural, and intellectual figures, especially in Europe and the United States, go out of their way to praise Israel and shower it with the greatest largesse of any nation on earth, even though many of them are aware of the injustices of the country. They say nothing about those. The result is an ideological smoke screen that more than any single individual Shahak has labored to dissipate. A Holocaust victim and survivor himself, he knows the meaning of anti-Semitism. Yet, unlike most others, he does not allow the horrors of the Holocaust to manipulate the truth of what, in the name of the Jewish people, Israel has done to the Palestinians. For him, suffering is not the exclusive possession of one group of victims. It should instead be, but rarely is, the basis for humanizing the victims, making it incumbent on them not to cause suffering of the kind that they suffered. Shahak has admonished his compatriots not to forget that an appalling history of anti-Semitism endured does not entitle them to do what they wish just because they have suffered. No wonder, then, that he has been so unpopular, since by saying such things, Shahak has morally undermined Israel's laws and political practices towards the Palestinians. Shahak goes even further. He is an absolute and unwavering secularist when it comes to human history. By this I do not mean to say that he is against religion, but rather that he is against religion as a way of explaining events justifying irrational and cruel policies, aggrandizing one group of believers at the expense of the others. What is also surprising is that Shahak is not, properly speaking, a man of the left. In a whole variety of ways, he is very critical of Marxism and traces his principles to European freethinkers, liberals, and courageous public intellectuals like Voltaire and Orwell. What makes Shahak even more formidable as a supporter of Palestinian rights is that he does not succumb to the sentimental idea that because the Palestinians have suffered under Israel, they must be excused for their follies. Far from it. Shahak has always been quite critical of the PLO's sloppiness, its ignorance of Israel, its inability to resolutely oppose Israel, its shabby compromises and cult of personality, its general lack of seriousness. He has also spoken out forcefully against revenge or honor killings Palestinian women and has always been a strong supporter of feminist liberation.